Dirt 5 is the latest racing game to hit Stadia, and today I'm here to tell you whether or not it's worth picking up. It's a very popular racing franchise that's taken quite a dramatic turn with Dirt 5. Whether it's for you or not really depends on the type of game you're looking for. If you're going into this expecting more of a dirt rally style game, well, you're gonna be disappointed. It's an arcade racer through and through. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Honestly speaking, I would actually argue that this is one of the best arcade racers I've played in a really long time. It's very comparable to the arcade racing games of the PS2 and PS3 era, the good and the bad. So let's begin by talking about the good, and thankfully it nails probably what is the most important aspect of a racing game, and that's the gameplay. As I mentioned previously, as long as you tone your expectations to not expect a realistic driving experience, there's a lot of fun to be had here. And just because they're not trying to simulate driving in general does not mean that all vehicles feel the same. That couldn't be further from the truth. Dirt 5 manages to make every vehicle class feel wildly different from the last, and I shouldn't be too surprised considering who's behind the game. That's because a lot of the core team that worked on this is also the same team that brought us MotorStorm, a game that was widely recognized for making every vehicle class type feel wildly different, and the same applies here. Another thing the team is extremely good at is making sure that every terrain type also affects your car differently. The first time you drive on ice, you're gonna notice it, and it's gonna impact your driving a lot until you get used to it. That's not to say that it's hard, you can pretty much adapt to it fairly quickly, but it is a very noticeable difference when swapping from gravel to dirt to ice. And this sort of detail matters a ton in a racing game, be it arcade or simulation. It adds variety to the overall gameplay, and that's where I'm happy to report that Dirt 5 doesn't lack any of that. Another really positive note is that the game itself does run at 60 FPS. Now, I should point out that some users have encountered some stuttering. That being said, in my own play sessions when streaming at 4K both on PC and Chromecast Ultra, I never ran into any issues like that. But since we're on the topic of performance, I do think it's time we switch to the bad, and I need to talk about the resolution. The game appears to be running at 1080p upscaled to 4K, and while that isn't a deal breaker, it certainly is noticeable. My first time playing Dirt 5 wasn't on Stadia, in fact it was a launch title I picked up for my PlayStation 5. And everything does look quite a bit more sharper on that version of the game, be it the ground textures, vehicle textures, or even environmental details. And while I'm not expecting a like-for-like comparison with next-gen consoles, I do think that the Stadia server blade can definitely do better than 1080p 60. We've seen it push much higher resolutions than that on much larger scale games already. But with that being the case, I do need to give him credit for at least targeting 60 FPS as I mentioned before. That's infinitely more important to a racing game. The other big negative that I really have to share is the fact that the game does feel like it lacks overall depth. That's not to say that there isn't a diverse selection of content, especially when it comes to the vehicles, but they do kind of all tend to blur into each other after a while. For example, just because some of the event types are named differently doesn't really mean that they're all that different from each other. That's not to say all the events are like this, but stuff like Land Rush and Stampede are hard to tell apart. When it comes to the tracks, they do look pretty good, but at the same time, they all feel extremely similar to a certain degree. It's to the point where I wouldn't say there's a standout track that actually stood out to me. The last big issue I want to talk about isn't necessarily tied only to Dirt 5, but also Stadia itself. And that's player base issues. Seriously, unless you know people playing Dirt 5, it may actually be quite hard to find a match. The game doesn't support crossplay, that means it's relying entirely on those who pick up the game on Stadia. From personal experience, over this past weekend, I've tried to play online about 5 different times at different points of each day, and I haven't been able to find one lobby. It's sadly a big issue, especially if online is your preferred style of play. On the bright side, Playground Mode, which allows for user-created tracks, does seem to be cross-platforms in terms of the tracks available. But if you're looking to compete for global leader times, once again the player base issue arises. Some of the featured tracks of the week only have 1 to 2 people listed in the global leaderboard. Others sit at around 10, and while I wasn't expecting this to be full, that's certainly a lot less than I was expecting. As for the reasoning why this be, well, I think there are several circumstances that come into play. First off, the game is coming out much later than it did for any other platform, and secondly, it's still full priced on Stadia. And while that is the regular price on Xbox, PSN, and Steam, it doesn't mean that those platforms haven't had steep discounts for this game already. And to top it off, I currently don't think the game is actually worth the full asking price. It's a good arcade racer, it's not bad by any means, but it's also not a great one. I often find myself wanting to like this game more than I do, because it does remind me of arcade racers of the past. Sadly, times have changed and expectations have changed along with it. One thing I didn't mention, if you noticed, was the career mode, and that's because it's extremely cookie cutter. It feels like a track selection screen for the most part. You'll hear some dialogue back and forth, but genuinely, I ended up skipping it most of the time because it really didn't add anything to the overall experience. And with that statement, my overall verdict is that if you're interested in playing Dirt 5 on Stadia, you can certainly have a good time playing it, but I would recommend waiting for a sale. Hopefully a pretty steep one like we've seen on other platforms, because it may renew interest in the game itself and populate the online servers quite a bit. So my honest advice to you is that if you're interested, you should probably just hold off for a sale. Now, if you enjoyed this video or found it helpful at all, be sure to hit that like button as it really does help the channel out, and if you're wanting more content like this, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell as well. Today's end of video question is going to be directed at those of you who've already picked up Dirt 5. Do you agree with my take? Do you disagree? Let me know down in the comment section below. All opinions are welcome, and I can't wait to read yours. As always, thank you for watching the video. This has been the Virtual Cloud, giving you the latest and greatest on everything cloud gaming and VR. And until next time, I'll catch you in the clouds.